The dust swirled in slow circles beneath a bleached sun, choking the breath out of Whistler's Hollow. There were no birds here. Only the groan of rusted iron signs swaying on chains, and the snap of leather reins pulling frightened girls from wagons they never meant to board. A half-rotten platform stood in the middle of the square. Men circled it like buzzards, scarred ranch hands, bounty hunters and drifters with dead eyes and blood on their boots. The auction was dressed up as entertainment, a trader's show, a traveling attraction. But no one was fooled. Not the law, which looked away. Not the town folk who kept their heads down. Not the girls, dragged up one by one like livestock, given numbers instead of names. Then came Lot 13. The trader yanked her forward by a rope tied to her wrists. Her bare feet stumbled on the splintered wood. She was thin, too thin. Dirt streaked her face and arms. Her hair was tangled, hanging over her eyes, and her lips were dry, cracked from silence and heat. But in her gaze there was a kind of fire, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that survives. Her chin stayed high. She didn't weep. She didn't tremble. She just stood there. The crowd scoffed. Too scrawny. She even got teeth. But she don't last a week. Lauder rippled. The trader tried to force a smile. Lot 13, he called out, voice oily and quick. Wild little thing. Needs taming, that's all. Startin' at $10. The first bid came lazy and mean, $2 and a boot. 5. Someone else spat, tossing a rusty coin toward the platform. 6 and a bottle of whiskey? The trader fidgeted. He glanced at the girl, at the defiance in her stance, the refusal to break. She was making them uncomfortable. That wasn't good for business. And then he appeared. The laughter stopped like it had been cut with a knife. From the edge of the square, a horse stepped forward, black as coal, and atop it a figure all in dark leather, coat whipping with the wind, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. But everyone knew who he was. Gideon Slate. Whispers passed like prayers. Slate didn't know he was back. He's got blood on those hands. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Gideon dismounted, slow and deliberate, boots thudding against the ground like warning shots. He stepped through the crowd, his presence pushing men back without a word. His eyes, ice blue and cold, fixed on the girl. She stared back. Something flickered in that gaze. Recognition. Memory. She blinked. He stepped to the platform, reached into his coat. The trader's face blanched as Gideon pulled out a small leather pouch and spilled it on the table beside the girl. Gold, not dollars, not silver. Gold coins. Enough to buy every girl there. Twice, the crowd went dead silent. The trader licked his lips, nodded shakily. Sold, no one dared argue. Not with Gideon Slate. Not with the man who once shot 3 bandits through the eye in the dark. Not with the man who owned a quarter of the valley and had his own cemetery out back. He untied the rope from the girl's wrists. She flinched but didn't pull away. He didn't say a word, just walked. She followed, and behind them Whistler's Hollow held its breath. Because when Gideon Slate made a move, death usually followed. But today he walked away with a girl in tow, not a corpse. And that silence, it wasn't relief, it was fear. Out of Whistler's Hollow was a long and bitter one, lined with cacti, whispers, and the dry rattle of wind across open plains. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows that stretched across the desert like ghosts chasing the living. The girl rode behind Gideon, her arms wrapped around his waist, but she didn't cling like the others used to. Her touch was tense, hesitant, like she was forcing herself not to recoil. She made no sound. Her breath was shallow, as though too much of it might break the silence between them. Her hands, small, cracked, and bruised, gripped his coat loosely. The rope burns were still red across her wrists, the skin raw. Gideon felt them brush his sides with every step the horse took, and though he never looked back, his jaw clenched tighter with each mile. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The world was made of silence and hooves on dirt. After a few miles, Gideon pulled the reins. The horse slowed near a thin, winding creek that shimmered under the dying light. He dismounted without a word, unhooked the canteen from his saddle, and filled it at the edge. The girl slid down awkwardly, her legs stiff. She stood like a bird too long caged, unsure if her wings still worked. He handed her the canteen. She stared at it for a beat too long. Then she reached for it. Her fingers brushed his. Just a second. And he saw it again. Her eyes dark and wide like someone else's. Someone from a different life. She drank, then handed it back. Still no words. Gideon stared at her as she turned away, pretending to focus on the sky, the grass, the nothingness. 12 years. He'd buried that number in the deepest part of himself, but it rose now and asked. 12 years ago. A ranch near the edge of Dust Valley had gone up in flames. The Hollow Men. They weren't just thieves, they were butchers. They came in the night, masked and ruthless. He remembered the smoke, the screams, the blood soaked into the wooden floors. He remembered finding his wife's body, torn, broken, and the tiny nightgown his daughter used to wear stained red beside the crib. No bodies for the little one, just ash and loss. Gideon had hunted the Hollow Men for years, leaving a trail of justice and vengeance in his wake, but the girl he'd buried her in his heart, alongside hope, alongside softness. Now here was this child, this silent, broken thing. She moved like his daughter once did. Not the same face, not exactly, but something familiar in the shape of her eyes, in the tilt of her head when she listened to the wind. He turned from her, staring at the horizon like it might offer answers. Was it possible? Could it be? She wasn't saying anything. But maybe she didn't know. Or maybe, just maybe, she was waiting for him to. They mounted again. The sun was bleeding out behind them. The world cast in gold and gray. Still, she said nothing. And still, he didn't ask. The sun had long dipped below the horizon by the time they reached Slate Ranch. A sprawling kingdom of cracked fences, sun-bleached barns, and wind that never stopped whispering through the dry grass. Once it had been full of life. Horses running, children laughing, warm dinners set on the porch as the sky burned pink. Now it stood like a monument to silence. Gideon dismounted silent as ever and helped the girl down. She didn't thank him, just looked around, taking in the emptiness of it all. The main house loomed ahead, grand but tired, its paint faded, its windows like watching eyes. A lantern flickered near the barn. Elias emerged, grizzled, grumpy, and loyal to a fault. His gray beard twitched as he squinted at the girl. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "What are you doing? Bringing a child here like a prize ox?" Gideon didn't answer. He didn't even blink. Elias frowned. "You buy her." No response. The girl stepped slightly behind Gideon, but not in fear, more like instinct. She was used to being questioned, spoken over, ignored. Elias scoffed. "Ain't my business, I guess. But this place don't need more ghosts, Gideon." Still nothing. Elias sighed and walked back toward the barn, shaking his head. Inside the house, the air was thick with dust and silence. The furniture was covered in linen sheets. No fire burned in the hearth. The only light came from a single oil lamp Gideon lit on the mantel. The girl stepped in slowly, cautiously, like she was trespassing. She looked around, at the walls, the worn floorboards, the long, quiet hallway. Her fingers trailed along a dusty banister. She didn't speak, but her eyes were wide with something like wonder, or maybe recognition. Then she saw it, a portrait, hanging just off-center on the far wall, a woman in her 20s, laughing softly in the painted stillness, her hair loose and dark, in her arms a small toddler, chubby-cheeked, with eyes too big for her face and a hand tugging at her mother's necklace. The girl froze. Gideon noticed but said nothing. She stepped closer slowly, like gravity was pulling her toward it. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice quiet. Unsure, Gideon looked at the portrait, at the life it captured and the pain it preserved. "My ghosts?" he said, and nothing more. The girl's gaze lingered on the toddler in the painting. Her head tilted, the way a memory tries to surface from somewhere deep inside the soul. Something flickered in her eyes. Not a full realization. Not yet. But something shifted. She turned to Gideon. He was already walking away, his shadow stretching down the hallway. She stood there a moment longer, staring at the child in the painting, as if trying to remember a dream she wasn't sure she'd ever had. Then she followed him into the quiet. The house had long since gone to sleep, but the girl hadn't. The silence pressed on her chest, thick and heavy, as she wandered the hallway barefoot, her thin nightgown brushing the wooden floor. The moonlight spilled through cracked windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like fading memories. Something drew her to the end of the hall. She paused outside a narrow door, its handle crusted with years of disuse. Gently she turned it. It creaked open, revealing a room shrouded in dust and stillness, a time capsule untouched. The furniture was small, a child's bed, a shelf of stuffed animals, faded curtains with yellowing stars. She stepped inside like she was stepping into someone else's dream. In the corner sat a little wooden music box shaped like a flower. Curious, she knelt and turned the crank. The soft, delicate notes of a lullaby filled the air, notes that floated like feathers, notes that hit something deep inside her chest. She gasped. Then her chin trembled. The song was too familiar. She didn't just know it, she remembered it. Her small hands clenched around the music box as the tears came silently, streaking down her cheeks. A sob escaped her lips. Just one, but enough to echo. That's when Gideon appeared in the doorway. He hadn't slept either. Something had kept him pacing the porch until the wind drove him inside. Now, he stood frozen, his eyes locked on the girl crumpled on the nursery floor. She looked up at him, the music box still playing. He took one slow step forward. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, his voice hoarse, like it had been scraped raw. She looked at him through a blur of tears. "My mother used to sing it," she whispered. Every night before the fire. Gideon's breath caught. He staggered slightly and gripped the doorframe to steady himself. Then, with trembling hands, he crossed the room to a dresser. He opened the top drawer and rummaged through old keepsakes, baby shoes, a tiny knitted sock, a faded ribbon, until he found what he was looking for, a silver locket. He opened it slowly, reverently, like it might crumble in his fingers. Inside, a photo of a baby girl and an engraving to Rosalie, "Love always." He turned to her. The girl's mouth fell open. She took a step back, like the truth was too big for her to stand under. My name's Rose," she said, voice shaking. Short for Rosalie. The locket slipped from Gideon's fingers, dangling from the chain as he dropped to his knees. "Rosalie," he breathed. "It can't be." She stared at him. "I was told my father died." He closed his eyes, pain contorting his face. "I thought I lost you in the fire. I came back and there was nothing left." She shook her head. "I was taken. Someone pulled me out. I don't remember much. Just heat, smoke, my mother screaming." He reached out a trembling hand. She took it. And then suddenly, like a dam breaking, they were in each other's arms. Gideon clutched her tight, like he might lose her again if he let go. 12 years of grief poured out of him in heavy sobs. 12 years of wondering, of guilt, of rage. And Rosalie, she wept into his shoulder. The years of confusion, the ache of abandonment, the unanswered questions, none of it mattered now. She wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't broken anymore. For the first time in 12 long, brutal years, there was light in the house again. And the music box kept playing its lullaby. Soft, slow, like the heartbeat of something lost finally returning home. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Rosalie, still not used to the name falling from someone else's lips, spent mornings walking the wide stretches of Slate Ranch. The land was dry but vast, whispering of stories older than memory. And each day, she found herself drifting back to the porch where Gideon sat, always watching, always waiting to see if she'd return. And she always did. Their conversations were hesitant at first, like touching a wound neither was sure had fully closed. But little by little the silence broke. "I don't remember everything," she said one afternoon, her eyes on the hills. "Just flashes." Gideon nodded, jaw tight. "You don't have to." She looked down at her hands, picking at a thread on her sleeve. The fire was loud. Hot. I was hiding under the bed. I remember someone pulling me out. A man. He smelled like smoke and whiskey. Gideon's face twitched. He didn't interrupt. "They passed me around," she continued. "Told me my family was gone. That no one was coming. At first I didn't believe them. Then I stopped hoping." He swallowed hard. "The hollow men," he said grimly. "They burned whole towns like they were campfires. For sport. For gold. For revenge." Her eyes found his. "You knew them." "I hunted them," he said darkly. "For years. I left this ranch and chased their ashes across 5 states. Found them one by one. Some I killed in duels. Some I made disappear." She didn't flinch at the confession. Instead, she leaned in. "What made you stop?" He stared out at the distant Mesa, eyes unreadable. When there were none left to kill, Rosalie studied his profile hard, scarred, tired, the legend everyone feared. But she saw the man behind the myth now, the man who waited for ghosts. "You kept this place alive," she said softly. "Why?" He pointed. "And next to her I buried what was left of you. A small charred body too burned to tell." Rosalie's eyes welled. "But it wasn't me." He looked at her finally. "No, but I didn't know. I buried your bones. Or thought I did." A long silence stretched between them, thick with the ache of what was stolen and what almost never returned. Then her voice cracked. "Why didn't you find me?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a child's question, delayed by 12 years. Gideon exhaled shakily. "Because I thought you were dead. And after what I did to avenge you, I wasn't sure I deserved to look." Her lips trembled. She reached across the table and took his hand. His was larger, rough and scarred, burn marks, blade nicks, the shaky memory of gunpowder and grief. Her own hand, though smaller, bore bruises and calluses of a different kind. But they fit, awkwardly, perfectly, like two halves that had once been whole. "You still have the locket," she said. He nodded. "Always." Neither spoke for a while. The wind rustled the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed. And in that silence, healing began, not loudly or instantly, but gently through shared pain, spoken truth, and the unfamiliar comfort of knowing someone else had survived the same fire. They sat there as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows behind them, two survivors, two halves of a broken story, finding the courage to begin again. The first real morning came with birdsong instead of nightmares. Rosalie rose, as she now preferred, woke to sunlight streaming through a clean window. Her room still carried the scent of old wood and something faintly floral, like her mother's perfume lingering in the dust. She stood, stretched, and pulled on boots that were still too big, but they felt like home. Outside, the ranch buzzed gently with life. Horses stamped their hooves. Chickens clucked. Wind moved over the grass like a soft hand brushing through hair. She found Gideon already at the stables, feeding oats to a chestnut mare. He looked up as she approached, nodded once and said, "She likes to be brushed behind the ears." It wasn't much, but it was enough. That day and those that followed became their quiet rhythm. Rose started caring for the animals, feeding them, talking to them, even laughing when one of the goats tried to eat her dress. Her laughter was new to the ranch. Even the wind seemed to pause when it happened. Gideon taught her to ride, sitting high on the saddle beside her, guiding her hands on the reins. Her first few attempts were clumsy, filled with stiff arms and nervous shouts, but by the end of the week, she was galloping over the fields with her hair flying like a flag of victory. Shooting came next. He placed the revolver in her hands carefully, gently, like it was something sacred. "You don't shoot to kill," he told her. "You shoot to protect what you love." She nodded, eyes steady, and with his hand guiding hers, she hit the bottle on the fence post with a clean, sharp crack. Inside the house, Rose discovered a bookshelf covered in dust. Her mother's books, worn spines, pressed flowers between pages and margins filled with neat handwriting. Gideon sat with her each evening, reading by lantern light. Sometimes he read aloud, other times she did. She stumbled over words, but he never corrected her too quickly. One afternoon, Rose found a broken post buried near a tree in the yard. It was part of a swing. She stared at it for a long time before speaking. "There was a swing here." Gideon nodded. "You called it your sky chair." Without another word, he spent the next day cutting new wood, sanding it down, and tying thick rope to the old tree. Rose helped, holding nails, steadying beams, tying knots. When it was done, she sat on the swing, kicking off the ground, and for the first time in 12 years she flew. At dinner, they didn't speak much, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of people who understood each other without needing to fill the space. She passed him the bread. He poured her water. Their eyes met across the table and held, not in grief or guilt, but in something softer, something forgiving. Later that night, she found Gideon on the porch, looking up at the stars. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He shook his head. "Used to want to. Thought the world out there would make the memories quieter." She sat beside him. "And now?" He smiled. A real one this time, small and cracked at the edges, but true. "Now I think this is where healing starts." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Me too." The stars shone brighter that night, as if even the heavens were beginning to believe in second chances. And on the wind, nothing but peace moved through Whistler's Hollow. A place that once only knew loss, now echoing with the sound of quiet love, hard-won joy, and two souls learning to live again. The quiet that had begun to take root at Slate Ranch shattered one cold evening under a blood-colored sky. Rose had just set the table when the dogs began barking. Not the usual bark of excitement, but sharp, frantic bursts that made the horses restless and set Gideon's hand instinctively to the pistol on his belt. The sound of hooves followed. Fast, multiple riders. Gideon stepped outside, shotgun in hand. Elias joined him on the porch, old but steady, loading his rifle in silence. Rose stood behind the doorframe, heart racing. Dust rose over the hill as 5 shadowy figures emerged, grimy, snarling men on lean horses, each face a ghost from Gideon's past. But it was the man at the center who made Gideon's jaw tighten like a coiled spring. Duke Harper. He hadn't aged well. His face was a mess of scars and his eyes were pale and cruel. A snake in spurs. "Well, well," Duke drawled, pulling his horse to a stop. "Didn't think we'd find you this far out, Rose. We expected you back at camp. All broken in by now." Rose flinched, but stood her ground behind the wall. Gideon took a step forward. "You tracked her." Duke smirked. We saw what happened at Whistler's Hollow. Trader didn't take kindly to losing merchandise. You interrupted business, old man. She's not merchandise, Gideon said. She's mine. Duke's grin faded. She was bought, paid for. That makes her property. And property doesn't run off. Gideon's voice dropped like a hammer. You bought a girl. I found my blood. The air turned electric. Hands hovered near holsters. I should have known you'd be soft under all that legend. Duke hissed. You got old slate. Ain't no myth left in you now. You want to test that. Gideon's eyes never left him. Then, gunfire. It started with a crack and ended in chaos. Elias fired first, hitting one of the riders square in the chest. The man tumbled from his horse like a rag doll. Another hollow man fired back, and Elias grunted, staggering backward. Clutching his side, Elias. Rose screamed. Gideon moved like a man 30 years younger, rolling into cover behind a wagon wheel, firing 2 shots. One hit another rider between the eyes. The second grazed Duke's shoulder, sending him reeling. The horses screamed. A lantern tipped and shattered. Fire caught on the edge of the barn wall. Duke scrambled behind a trough, blood seeping through his coat. He fired blindly, shouting, "This ain't over!" You hear me, Slate? You think one daughter makes you whole. You're not done with us? Then, as quickly as they came, the surviving hollow men retreated into the night, leaving smoke, blood, and fury behind. Gideon rushed Elias, helping lower him to the porch. It's bad, Elias rasped, but his hand gripped Gideon's arm. You still shoot like hell. That's something. Rose knelt beside him, pressing cloth against the wound. Tears streaked her face, but her hands were steady inside. The house flickered with firelight and fear. Gideon stood at the door, blood on his coat, jaw clenched. His hands trembled not from weakness, but from rage. He looked out into the dark horizon. They know where we are now. Rose stepped beside him. Then we fight. Together. He turned to her, this girl who had once been a ghost from his grief, now standing firm. Scarred but whole. You're not a child anymore, he said. No, she whispered. But I'm still your daughter. The flames behind them died out, but somewhere beyond the hills in the shadows of the west, the hollow men rode again, and they would return. But so would Slate, and this time he wasn't riding alone. The sun rose heavy over Slate Ranch, its golden light softening the brutal scars left behind by the night before. Smoke still lingered in the breeze, mixing with the fresh scent of earth. On the hill behind the main house, 2 graves stood now, one weathered and worn, the other fresh, marked with a handmade wooden cross. Elias Slate, loyal friend, brother in arms. Gideon stood beside the grave in silence, his hat held against his chest. Rose knelt by the mound of dirt, placing a bundle of wildflowers she had gathered that morning. Her fingers brushed the wooden cross as if trying to send one final message through the grain. Thank you, she whispered, for keeping him alive when I couldn't, for giving him someone to hold on to when the world took everything else. She sat back on her heels and looked toward the older grave beside it. The one marked only by the name, Clara Slate, and the faint outline of a child's handprint carved into the stone. 12 years ago, Gideon had buried his wife there, believing he had buried his child too. Now, standing there with his daughter beside him, it felt like one soul had returned for another. I should have known Elias would die with his boots on, Gideon said quietly, voice gravelly from smoke and sorrow. Hay always said the ground wouldn't take him lying down. Rose managed a faint smile, but her eyes shimmered. She looked up at him. They'll come again, won't they? He nodded slowly. Duke ain't done. Men like him never are. He lost too much power when you slipped through his fingers. He'll want to take back what he thinks is owed. Gideon turned and walked back to the house. Rose followed, silence hanging between them like fog. Inside, the air was cool, the shadows long. He went to the chest beneath his bed and pulled it open. From inside, he took out a revolver. Polished steel, its handle worn smooth by years of use. He looked at it for a long moment before handing it to her. It's old, he said, but it's steady. Saved my life more times than I can count. She stared at it, then at him. If I fall, he said, his voice low and unflinching, you finish it. You don't let them take you again. Her hands tightened around the grip. She held it not like a child playing hero, but like someone who had known what it meant to be powerless, and never wanted to feel that again. No one's taking me from home again, she said, the words quiet but solid as stone. Gideon looked at her, and for the first time since he had laid eyes on her at that cursed auction, he didn't see a lost girl. He saw his daughter. Not just in name, but in blood and fire and grit. Your mother would be proud, he said, voice thick with old memories. So would Elias, she replied. They stood in the doorway, side by side, gazing out over the fields and hills beyond. The land they'd fight for, the home they'd keep. Whatever came next, they were no longer broken pieces drifting alone. They were family again, and family held the line. The seasons turned gently over Slate Ranch, as if the land itself knew it was time to let go of pain. Spring crept in with quiet kindness. Flowers bloomed along the edges of the porch, climbing up worn wooden beams like nature was reclaiming peace. Where once silence had ruled, now there was laughter, the sound of hooves against soft dirt, children shouting in joy, the rhythmic creak of the stable doors swinging open. Rose stood in the paddock, a confident hand guiding a young boy through the basics of riding. The horse beneath him whinnied softly, while Rose smiled and offered patient, calm instructions. Her hair, no longer tangled and caked with dirt, shone in the sun. Her skin had healed. Her eyes, once empty, now held light. Gideon sat nearby on the porch in a rocking chair, spectacles perched on his nose, a worn leather-bound book open in his lap. His gun hung from a peg by the door, not forgotten, just resting. Occasionally, he'd look up from the page to watch her, his Rosalie, moving through the world with strength and grace. And each time, his heart ached not from grief, but from the beauty of witnessing something thought lost return stronger than before. Elias's grave had been marked with a proper stone now. The children placed flowers there when they came to the ranch. Rose always made sure it never looked untended. The air around Slate Ranch had changed. It no longer smelled of old ashes and sorrow. It smelled of baking bread, of saddle leather and hay, of a life slowly built back up from ruin. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows and golden fire across the plains, Rose walked from the barn with a brush in hand, a braid half finished on the mane of the gentlest mare. Gideon looked up from his book and smiled. She crossed the yard and sat beside him on the porch steps. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, wordlessly, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't flinch or shift. He just rested his cheek on the top of her head, and together they watched the sky turn to flame. Their silhouettes bathed in the last light of day, still and peaceful, like two souls who had finally outrun the darkness. As the screen slowly fades to black, Gideon's voice comes in, a low, weathered echo carried on the wind. He rode into Whistler's Hollow to buy a stranger, but instead he found a memory, a heartbeat, a daughter, and in doing so, he found the man he thought had died with her,